Here I've created a new program, Classes 2, that is the departure point from Classes 1, our previous program. We have an employee class that has 2 properties. Let's give it a few more. As you can see, I've added a salary, a starting date, and a phone number. When we instantiated our employee, Dave, we did so with a new keyword, an employee, and empty parentheses. There are 3 ways to get data into that instance of Dave. We've seen one already, where we simply assign that data. A second way is called initialization. With initialization, at the time we create the employee, we also initialize one or more of the properties. To do that, let's delete the assignment and the semicolon after new employee and create braces for the initialization. Within those braces, I can initialize any or all of the properties. And notice that IntelliSense in Visual Studio tries to help by showing me a list of each of the properties. So we'll set age equal to 35, comma, and we'll set name equal to, now we've called this employee Dave. That's the name of the object. That's not necessarily the name of the employee. But for convenience, let's call this person David Smith. In addition to name, we can set the salary, and we'll set that to 50,000.00 because that's a double and can take a fraction or can take cents. The starting date is a date time, and to set that we're going to need a new date time object. Now notice IntelliSense has popped up and it has said there are 12 different ways to set a new date time. And you can click on those arrows or use your down arrows to scroll through the different ways to set a date time. The one we want is this one, where you pass in a year, a month, and a day. So we'll say that Dave started in 2012, in July, on the 10th. And then we have phone number, which we'll set to a string, as it's called for. And then after the closing brace, we put a semicolon. And that initializes all of the fields for this particular object. We can now go ahead and extract some of this information in a write-line statement. So here we're using substitution parameters. Dave's age is parameter first. He started on parameter 1 and makes parameter 2. Parameter first, or parameter 0, is Dave.age. The starting date is Dave.startingdate. And the salary is Dave.salary. Let's run that. And sure enough, it says Dave's age is 35. He started on 7/10/2012 at 12 o'clock a.m. And we can modify the display to show the date in the format we want. This is the default format, and makes 50,000. And once again, we might want to modify the 50,000 to put a $sign and a comma. But for now, we can see that the data has been placed inside the object. The third way to create or to add data to a new object is with a special method called a constructor. Now, we've only alluded to methods, but methods are simply functions that are members of the class. And most methods are very normal in that they have a return type or void. They take 0 or more parameters, and there's a body to the method. So, for example, we might give the employee class a method called bonus. So let's look at this method that we've added to our employee class called bonus. Bonus does not return a value, so we have it return void. It takes one argument of type double called bonus percent. And what it does is it adds to the salary times bonus percent. We can come down to our running program that we've been building and give Dave a bonus by calling Dave.bonus and passing in 5%. Now let's take a look at what we get when we write out his age, starting date, and salary after the bonus. So we'll hit Control F5, and it says now that he makes $52,500. He's had a 5% raise. So that's a standard method of the class, but we were talking about constructors. Constructors are special methods of the class, and they are used to construct an instance. What's interesting about constructors is that they don't have a return type at all, not even void, and they must have the name of the class itself, in this case, employee. They do typically take parameters, and what is very common is for them to have a parameter for each of the properties of the class. So they might have an int for age, and a string for name, and so on for each of the various properties. Then within the body of the constructor, you can assign these passed-in parameters to the property. And so you can say age equal age, and name equal name, and so forth. Now you have a way of constructing the object by passing parameters in to the constructor at the time you create the object. Notice that our employee with a paren and nothing in it now has a red squiggly line. Any constructor that has no parameters is called a default constructor. And in fact, if you don't create a constructor, you are given a default constructor by default. That default constructor, which takes no parameters that you get by default, does nothing. And that's why we had to do the initialization. However, now that I've created a constructor, I no longer get my free default constructor. Fortunately, we can do something called method overloading, where we have two methods with the same name, but different parameters, either different types or a different number of parameters. In this case, it'll be a very different number of parameters. We'll say public employee and have no parameters, and we'll have our default constructor do nothing. And that will continue to do as it did before, but it will allow us to do this initialization. We now have a constructor. We can construct an employee by passing in values. So let's create a new employee, Mary, equal new employee, and this time we're going to use our second constructor. Notice IntelliSense says there are two constructors, and if I hit the down arrow, it will show me the constructor that takes the various parameters. And it's very easy to fill them in because IntelliSense takes you through them one by one. So the first one is Mary's age. We'll make her 25. The next one is her name. We'll make it Mary Jones. Next is her salary, and let's give her a salary of $60,000. Her start date, which will be a new date time of, and let's flip through the date times to find the one we want, year, month, day. So she started in 2010 on February 29th. Hit the comma, and it says you still need the phone number as a string. Now we have created an employee not by initializing it, by passing in values to the constructor. And yet, we can once again add a console write line. And now let's run the program. And we've got Mary's age is 25. She started on February 28th. You may have noticed that I had originally put in February 29th of 2010, but there's no such date, and so I got an error. So I fixed that to February 28th of 2010 and make 60,000. Key here is we were able to set all of the values in the employee object through the constructor that took those arguments. We could, of course, have a constructor that takes some arguments and not others, and we can even use initialization when we have a constructor. So you can mix and match these various ways of putting data into your object.